Good evening. I'm Dora Costa. I'm the chair of UCLA's Economics Department. The department is very pleased to present this panel discussion on economic policy challenges facing the next president. Our moderator, Dr. Laurence E. is the co-founder and managing principal of Laurel Crown Partners, a family-owned private equity fund focused on investing in growth-oriented businesses. His business management and investment background ranges from the healthcare industry, and he is an MD, all the way to the NFL, where he and his family are the largest limited partners in the ownership of the Pittsburgh Steelers NFL franchise. Our panelist, John B. Taylor, is the Mary and Robert Raymond Professor of Economics at Stanford University and the George P. Schultz Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He is widely recognized for path-breaking research in macroeconomics, monetary economics, and international economics. He served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors from 1989 to 1991 and as Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs from 2001 to 2005. He thus lived through the 2002 global financial crisis, and for his work in resolving this crisis, received the Treasury's Distinguished Service Award. Lee Ohanian is our other panelist, and he is Professor of Economics and Director of the Ettinger Family Program in Macroeconomic Research at UCLA. Go Bruins. He is also a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and an advisor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. He writes and testifies extensively about economic policy issues. Lee is widely known for his research on economic crises and government policy responses to crises. There will be many challenges up ahead, and before we start tonight's event, Lee will say a few words about our plans for similar events in the future.
Thank you, Dora. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted that you can join us tonight and be part of our first public event that's sponsored by the economics program at UCLA. We hope this will be the first of many that we will do in the coming years that will bring together UCLA economists and leading economists and policymakers from other parts of the world to help us and you understand the economic issues that are pressing for today and as we go into the future. And these will fall under the umbrella of a new planned research center within our economics department with a planned title of the Center for Research in Innovation, Growth, and Markets. And what better way to inaugurate this series than to talk about some of the most topical and timely issues, economic policy challenges facing our next president. And I'm delighted that John and Larry can be part of this. So gentlemen, thank you so much. And Larry, congratulations on the Steelers thus far this year. That's wonderful, wonderful news, and I'm glad you can tear yourself away from the NFL to join to be with us tonight. Let me turn it over to our moderator, Larry, and then we'll tee off from there.
Lee, thank you, and thank you to UCLA. To the folks we have joining us remotely, I just want to remind people that the last segment of this is going to be a question and answer segment. We would kindly ask you to submit questions in the chat, and we have folks that sort of go through those and try to pull out the ones that we think will sort of draw sort of the most attention, and use that last portion of this presentation to get to your questions directly. But as a way to kick off, since John and Lee, you are the experts here, and you have titled this panel "Economic Policy Challenges Facing the Next President." I think the best way to start is just to sort of set the playing field here for everybody. In your opinion, can you characterize, if I go back to February or March, pre-pandemic, pre-California shutting down, pre-New York shutting down, where were we with the challenges in the economy pre-pandemic? What has the pandemic done to those over the course of the last 7 or 8 months? And what are the expected effects of where either potential president could take the economy from here?
Okay, so let me start off by saying that just prior to the pandemic, the US economy was performing really very, very well. Unemployment was at its lowest level since the 1960s. Unemployment rates for Hispanic workers and African American workers were at all-time lows. Productivity growth, which is by far the most important determinant of future living standards and economic growth, was at 1.5%, up from about 0.8% just before that. And just to really drive home the point, the importance of productivity growth, at 1.5%, worker productivity in this country doubles about every 45 years. At 0.8%, it takes about 90 years to double. So we had a very robust economy operating just prior to the pandemic. Larry, you mentioned California. The California economy really is the second in a tale of two economies compared to the United States. California was already showing signs of some economic weakness before the pandemic. Our state, and I know we have people tuning in from all over the world, but for Californians, our state had lost about 180,000 people just prior to the pandemic, is suggesting that California has become a state that's very, very costly to live in. The median home price in the state, single family, is now over $700,000. In San Francisco, it's about $1.7 million for a median home price, which means that just qualifying for a mortgage on that home means you have to be in about the top 1 percentile of household income. So as we go through this, we'll try to draw some parallels between California and the United States. As a whole, the US is now rebounding from the pandemic. We lost about 21 million jobs. We've gained back about half of those. So the recovery we've seen has been just remarkably fast, much faster than certainly I anticipated.
And to that end, are the jobs that we've regained the same ones that we lost, or are they coming back differently than the ones we lost?
Yeah, there's some sectors that really haven't rebounded, and for clear reasons such as hospitality, leisure, transportation, those have not come back. Restaurant jobs have not come back to the same extent, but some other service jobs and manufacturers come back more than we certainly had anticipated. So we've gained back in terms of job loss. We're down now about 10 million. We were down about 21 million before that. California's only recovered about 20% of our lost jobs. So California, again, is showing some more signs of weakness. But at this point, let me turn it over to John, and we can go from there.
Yeah, it's a great way to begin, Larry. I think things were going pretty well before COVID hit. And Lee's measured productivity quite right. We went from 0.8 up to 1.5. And I think a lot of that happened as a result of policy. I just mentioned that in 2017, we had a tax reform, we had regulatory reform coming in, and you can trace some of the changes to that. Growth was higher after that began. So I like to point to the change in the economy and also some of the policy that may have underlying these changes. I also think that when you see this rebound, you have to think about it. It's very complicated, as you were asking. Some sectors are doing well. One thing that's doing remarkable well is online stuff. Zoom's doing very well. And the person who founded Zoom is even better than most of us. So I think it's a sign that this economy needs to go in different directions. I think it'll be different as a result. We're already seeing that, but it's a remarkable rebound already. And I think a lot of that has to do with the private sector responding and trying to deal with the regulations. I think Lee's quite right to put a difference between California and other states. In fact, you're seeing huge differences between the states, and a lot of it depends on regulations, a lot of it depends on the policy. So we can learn from that. But I think basically what I'm looking at is the change in policy that I would say began 2017, 2016, 2018, wherever you want to put it. And that's mainly tax policy, mainly regulatory policy. Other things change too, which we can discuss, trade and monetary policy even as well. But I think I see that, and I don't think we should forget that when we look forward to seeing what we should do. I don't think we want to reverse the changes that we think were positive uh, in any way, shape, or form.
And John, to that end, as you think about the changes that, at 3 months they were temporary, at 7 months they're starting to feeling more permanent, whether it's a work from home mindset or as people are just adapting to a different way of life. What are some of those changes that we should expect to see economically in terms of growth, in terms of how people are employed, and including, what is underemployment or people who just return to the workforce differently look like?
Well, as for a certain people, it's very hard. In fact, that's one of the things that we've seen in the last few months is certain people, certain jobs, certain sectors have been harmed quite dramatically. And I think minorities in particular have been harmed by this. To some extent, I think that traces to policy too. For example, education is quite a difference. K-12 in different parts of the country, different parts of the state of California are handled in different ways. And people who have access to the internet are in better shape than those who are not. So if the public policy can deliver on that, it'll be a little bit better. But more generally, we are seeing a change, which I don't think is going to go away. Facebook says that half their employees will be online when we're through with this. If you go through the parking lots up here in Silicon Valley where I live, many of them are empty at this point. They'll be coming back, but not in the same way. And then I think there's, even medicine, telemedicine is becoming more popular. People are seeing that there's some advantages to that. And education, which I'm involved in. I'm teaching a class this quarter with over 300 students. They're all over the world. And there's some advantages and disadvantages to that, to be sure. So it's going to be a change, and there's going to be a shakeout. And hopefully we won't overregulate. We'll let the right things happen and take advantage of this situation and not be pulled down by the constraints and the disadvantages that are also there, of course.
Lee, is there anything else you want to add to that? Lee, you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, just to follow up on John's point, we've gone through just an awful crisis here in the last few months. But one thing that history teaches us is that crises and emergency situations lead us and lead governments to innovate. And John mentioned some of the innovations we're seeing, and some of these innovations could be a bit of a silver lining to what otherwise is just a horrible cloud we've been living through. One of which is that there may be much more telecommuting and remote working, which can have a salutary effect on one of the, at least in my mind, one of the most difficult policy issues that we're facing now, which are housing challenges in, particularly along the coast where many people, particularly younger people, want to live. I mentioned just how expensive it's become in California to buy a home or even just rent. Over close to 60% of California renters fall under the category of financially distressed, meaning they're paying much more of their income in home costs than what would be the industry standard. And if we have commercial buildings or industrial buildings that can be converted into mixed use buildings with including housing, this could go a long ways towards helping us with what is a housing crisis, not just in California, but more broadly along the Pacific coast and along the Atlantic coast. So I agree with John. We're going to be seeing some changes, many of which will be here to stay. And there'll be some long-term challenges as long as people are worried about travel with the virus. Hotels, airlines will continue to be under pressure. So we'll have to see how that evolves.
And so not to make either one of you futurists, if you sort of flash forward, the Biden economic plan has been laid out, I think, fairly clearly. Trump economic plan laid out a little bit less clearly. But as you guys think about a Trump victory next week or a Biden victory next week, what are the 2 or 3 things that you think about the economy sort of, what could be the big sort of either pluses or minuses to the economy? And then how does control of the Senate affect those things?
Well, I would think the thing that I'm concerned about with respect to the economy is regulation, because I think some of these examples which we're describing have to do with use of the internet, not restrictions on occupational licensing, the things that you can make the adjustments. So I think there's a concern about that. Some of it is state, some of it is federal. I think what would worry me if there was the regulations put in place that prevented these changes from occurring. And that is a danger. You never know. I mean, regulation is hard to change, doesn't change automatically. There have been some changes. But that's one thing that I think there's a tendency not to see beyond your nose, if you like, and see what's actually happening out there is quite remarkable. I think the online purchases is expanding. It's not going to make up completely. We're finding various ways to deal with with innovations, if you like, and to deal with the pandemic. So that's a concern. I think also tax policy is there's a change. There's a difference in the plans of the candidates at this point. And as far as we can tell, Trump would continue with the lower tax rates that came in 2017. And we hear that the Vice President Biden would not do that. He'd do it a little different. Of course, there's changes about whether it's under 400,000 or not. So there's some nuances. And then your question, Larry, about the makeup of the Senate is very important. No question about that. There could be, if it continues with the Republican control and Vice President Biden becomes president, then there'll be a slower movement than if it changes to the Democratic control, and vice versa. So it's not just the presidency. That's, of course, very important with respect to appointments and with respect to the philosophy. But many of these things require legislation and actions. And I think that depends on the rest of the legislatures as well.
So that actually leads me, he teed up a question for you, because if I go back to sort of my economics class in college, there was a lot of discussion about sort of how much does the White House really make a difference in how the country does. And I remember a lot being said about, economic changes take a while to run through the economy, and whether we're still getting the after effects of Obama administration or Trump administration effects. How much does who wins the election make a difference in where the country's going?
Yeah, great question. And there's really, I would say there's kind of a two-part answer to that. One part of the answer is that, the United States is just a remarkable economic machine. No other country has demonstrated this nearly 250-year record of, with the exception of a few hiccups, of almost constant economic growth, rapidly rising living standards. There's simply no other country that comes close to the long-run economic record of the United States. And my opinion, I think the opinion of most economists, is that's because of just the quality of our democratic institutions and the quality of the governance that have been in place in the country for so long. So from that perspective, you're a little bit like a CEO taking over, let's pick your favorite successful company, Amazon or Google, and saying, okay, here I am. Okay, guys and gals, let's keep it going. Great job. Let me try to stay out of the way and not get in the way of what you're doing. So there's part of that, and another part is that we are at a critical juncture with our economy and how policy might unfold. Because of the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, and because of the corona pandemic response, we've increased our federal debt from about 33% of GDP in 2007 up to probably about 110% of debt. Debt's now about 110% of GDP. We have not been at that number since World War II. That suggests, so to get back to your question about former Vice President Biden and President Trump, part of me wishes that both of them were maybe a little bit more fiscally conservative. President Trump was running deficits before COVID Former Vice President Biden has very ambitious set of public spending, expansionary public spending. And I think right now, when I look at both of their policy proposals, both are going to put a lot of pressure on continued growth in the debt. The Congressional Budget Office is a nonpartisan research organization that analyzes policies for Congress, and they project a debt to GDP of about 200%, which would just be, completely unprecedented by the year 2050 as the baby boom generation retires and more people enter the ranks of Medicare. One issue that does concern me a bit more about former Vice President Biden is an expansion of more public spending within the healthcare field. In my view, the way that we try to make healthcare more affordable and improve quality is by trying to realize this is an economic good. It's about the allocation of resources, and it's very hard to get affordable anything if we don't have consumers being cost conscious, and if we don't have providers and producers being transparent. And the Affordable Care Act didn't really deliver the savings it was advertised to deliver. So I do worry about that a bit. But more broadly, I do wish both of the candidates were somewhat more fiscally conservative.
So John, Lee raises a question, which I know I've gotten from other people in the past. When I was growing up, I was a slightly overweight kid. As my doctor used to say to me, you're not overweight, you're just under height. As long as you keep growing, you'll grow into your weight. With the amount of spending that's gone on, the amount of sort of fiscal injection into the economy that's gone on, at what point does the government run out of sort of dollar firepower spending in the economy when you think about things like a potential large infrastructure bill or those sorts of things? And can we grow our way out of this? Do people need to be worried about, obviously the Fed has said we're not worried about things like inflation right now, but at some point, are we overweight? And do we need to slim down a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think there's no question if there's not some adjustments, we'll be in trouble. I would say that there's no reason why there can't be, if there's another stimulus bill, we'll see, that along with that could be a plan to undo this. In other words, we had $1 trillion deficits before this, as Lee was pointing out, then it went up by a couple more trillion, and it doesn't need to stay that high, but you can lay out a plan. And I think it would be quite productive. Is suppose there's another package that's passed, and by the way, I'm not it questions whether you need it, but suppose there is, then simultaneously you lay out a plan to deal with the debt down the road. I think that would be very beneficial to the economy. It's at this point, it's hard to see how either candidate will focus on that right away because they're focusing so much on the shorter run. But if simultaneously you can deal with the longer run, and that's next year, the year after that, and it's difficult to make the choices. It may be do entitlement spending or whatnot, but there's where I think you ask about whether the White House makes a difference. I think it makes a considerable difference on certain policies where there's a philosophical difference. I think regulatory policy and tax policy is one. It's not really so clear there's a difference on the debt and the deficit, and on trade is not clear that how much the difference is. But where there's a difference, they can really make an effect. But I would say down the road, try to think simultaneously about doing something now, but undoing it later. There's no reason why you can't lay out a plan for the next 3 or 4 years. It's been done before. We can do that again.
And so really a question for both of you as everybody on this call sort of looks to you to say, when we flash forward 6 months from now, what are either the celebratory flares or the warning signs that we should see that the leadership is taking the economy in the right direction or the wrong directions? Or what are the things you'll be looking for to figure out if we're on the right path or the wrong path, other than just sort of philosophical views?
The fact that we've rebounded so quickly is really remarkably good news. So there's a lot to build on at the national level that's very, very productive and positive. As economists, we like to see policies promote the incentive to invest in plant equipment, in human capital, to invest in innovative ideas. So
So
the
is
kinds.
that, is that an infrastructure bill, Lee? I mean, is it, can you be more
Well,
specific?
yeah, I was actually referring more to private capital investment and innovations. I mean, there's no country that comes close to the United States in terms of innovative capacity. We look at the leading companies. Now, I mean, Larry, when you mention, what are sort of the warning signs? Long-run economic growth requires that an economy reinvent itself just continuously. So when we look at the private sector, we look at the economic giants of yesterday are not today's economic giants. General Motors, US Steel, Eastman Kodak. Some people might be young enough to be scratching their heads and saying, what's that guy talking about with Eastman Kodak? So today's leaders are companies like Amazon and Google that evolved from an information revolution made by people who are willing to take risks and who had remarkable ideas and brought them to market. So that's what we need to keep going in order to continue growing the economy. So we need to see a greater share of GDP devoted to investment. When we get a greater share devoted to consumption, that typically is growth that is slowing. So those are things that I would be looking for, and then we need policies that promote those types of investments. So policies that reduce uncertainty, policies that promote the high returns that people receive from inventive activity, from investment activities. So those
Can
are
you give a
things.
specific example, Lee, of 2 or 3 that would fit the bill?
Yeah. So we have right now a shortage of business startups. And right now, business startups, their main complaints are they have a hard time getting capital. And the reason I point to business startups is because, of the next 100,000 startups we have in the United States, we're hoping that a handful are going to be the next Amazons, the next Googles, or the next Apples. So we need to have this continuous coming in of startups. So they talk about access to capital, which we can facilitate with better financial market regulation and more transparency. They talk about difficulty in hiring qualified workers, which we can facilitate by expanding immigration of highly skilled individuals. When we look at the Fortune 500, over half of the Fortune 500 were founded or co-founded by an immigrant or the child of an immigrant. So those are things that I think that they're sort of, I would view them as kind of low-hanging fruit that I think we really should be pursuing.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the message here, and I agree with Lee, is we need to think about raising our growth rate down the road, and it's been low. We talked about productivity increasing in the last few years. That's good. But what are the policies that will make the U.S. grow faster? Not 2%, but 3%. It doesn't sound like that big a deal, but it's really huge for people. And for me here, you need to think about the regulation and the tax. As we supply side economics, whatever you call it, you don't want to tax people at the margin a lot. The lower tax on corporations makes sense. That's really a tax on investment in many respects. So you don't want to discourage that, because investment leads to more productivity, leads to higher growth rate. And so I would stress that as an example. But one thing that's rarely talked about is education. That's a human capital investment, and we can't forget that. I would hope that this pandemic is revealing some of the problems which we've had that's been under the table, but so far I haven't seen much concern about education. Can we do better on that? Can we have more choice, if you like, more ability to help the areas which are doing really poorly, and there are. And that is, I think, we have a chance to learn about how to do, if you like, good market-based policy, but do it better and deal with the areas that are not treated that well. Another example is zoning. Zoning is a real problem in certain parts. In California, it's a problem. You can't go somewhere, but you can go other places. And I think dealing with the zoning maybe sounds like just a micro thing, but it really is important for investment and for the kind of things that Lee has talked about are so important for the United States.
Larry, can I follow up on John's point? just for a
Of course,
second?
it's your panel. You can do whatever you want.
You're the man. I've given you the reins. So cut me off whenever you like. But yeah, just follow up on John's point about education. This is just so important because in any market economy, between 60 to 70% of income is paid to workers in the form of compensation to employees. It's by far the primary income source. And when we think about staffing future jobs, we need to have highly trained, I'm a father of three, and I know you have children, and John, you have children and grandchildren, and we think about the future that they're going to be working in. And we look at the United States K through 12, we, I think, should be performing at a higher level. Every 2 years, there's international comparisons of students across countries done in science and math for the obvious reason that those are the common languages that everyone will understand. And you test after test of this for years. The U.S. is performing far behind many other countries which are much poorer than the United States, which don't have the resources to devote to education. Even our highest performing state in the country, which is Massachusetts, even in Massachusetts, kids in Massachusetts are 2 full grade years behind Shanghai, China in math and science. And I think there's some common sense reforms we can implement to improve education. We tend not to pay teachers based on how difficult it is to hire in a particular area. So to hire a really good math teacher, to hire a really good science teacher, it requires paying a higher salary. The best teachers are worth it. They create incredible value in our students, including potentially a lifetime of the joy of learning. So paying teachers according to their specialty, introducing merit-based pay, which is fairly rare. Those are things I think we can implement. But as John noted, there's just not a lot of discussion of this in policy circles, really among either candidate.
So knowing how much of this economy is driven by small business, consumers, et cetera, knowing that uncertainty and consumer spending are somewhat inversely correlated, knowing there's a lot of uncertainty floating around, what causes consumers to spend again? What causes somebody who's a middle-class worker to come home and say, it's okay to go out and buy the capital, to buy the new refrigerator or the new car or whatever it's going to be? And under the theory that if you lose that, you can't have any sort of a recovery in any meaningful way.
Well, I think the most important thing generally is they have a sense of their income. And there's lots of economics that says that what you spend depends more on your permanent income. And that's been made famous by people like Milton Friedman. And the idea is that if you expect to have a better job, you expect that the economy is going to do better, then you're more confident in spending. Well, we find these temporary injections, people just save it. They don't spend very much of it. So the windfalls, if you like. So the most important thing, it seems to me, is give people confidence that the economy is going to get better. And of course, that depends very much on dealing with this pandemic, but that will give people the confidence. And, this savings goes up and down, but we know a fair amount about people's consumption. And it's this notion of a more permanent sense, confidence that you got a job or your family's going to be okay. The saving for the future is always important, but I would say that's the key. There's other things in terms of more regulatory stuff. Again, we could talk about California. We got AB5, we got Prop 22, which are trying to allow more flexibility in the labor force, so people can do part-time jobs, if you like, through Uber and Lyft, for example. And so there may be other things like that you can do on the regulatory side. Occupational licensing, it kind of squeezes some people out of the market. If we could deal with that better, it would help. It would generate more permanence, more sense that we're going to be okay. And these are all things which are kind of longer term, which people tend not to focus on them. But I think it's more important now than ever, because there's a tendency, and maybe this is what's going to happen if we're not careful. Hey, this economy recovered because of the government policy. I don't think that's true. I think it's because of the economy not because of the stimulus package, but there'll be confusion, there'll be debates, there always is, about what was the source of things getting better if they do get better. And so we need to, that's why the economics of this discussion is so important. I'm glad we're focusing on economics in this discussion.
Lee, anything you want to add? Or-
Yeah, so so that's kind of the classic question about how do you get a recovery out of recession is the idea that, who spends first? Is it consumers or is it businesses? And what we're already seeing is that there's been really a substantial rebound of consumer spending since the summer. Consumer spending declined about 9 or 10% from its February level. And these are data that we get monthly, so we can track these almost in real time. And we're now only down about 3%. So about 70% of the drop in consumer spending has already bounced back. So I think households households I think, are remarkably prescient. Whenever we look at a recession recovery and we look at their decisions, oftentimes we say, they were seeing down the road pretty accurately. So I think they're seeing that the economy, post-COVID, is going to be a pretty good one, potentially. Obviously, treatments are being expanded, and there's over 170 vaccines that are in trial right now. So out of 170, you think that at least one will hit the wall and stick and be very effective. But I think there's an awful lot to be optimistic about in this economy. As we go forward and as we get past the worst of the pandemic. And just one cautionary note, we kind of live in a society now where, at least I don't know about you folks, but almost, so many aspects of our lives have become politicized. And I meet people who say, gosh, the government's the villain. And I meet other people who say, gosh, the government is really our savior and our protector. And, for those people and then everybody in between, what I would say is just keep in mind is that the government is a collection of organizations that are staffed by people just like us that have the same incentives and the same interests. And we just have to make sure that we have the right rules in place to influence incentives the way we want. Because within the public sector, there's not a profit motive. There's not that guiding decisions. And so when we think about a public sector that's large, that gets potentially larger, and for the most part, our public sector has gotten larger over the last 50 or 60 years, that we need to be careful and think about that because we want our public sector to perform well. And, John mentioned California, and we had this bill called AB5, which was a bill that made it essentially illegal for a lot of people to work as an independent contractor. So for example, a tow truck driver with a AAA affiliation can work as an independent contractor. A tow truck driver without a AAA affiliation cannot work as an independent contractor, but rather must be hired as an employee. And so when we look at bills like this that seem to interfere and impede with economic freedom, we wonder, why are our elected officials, sort of giving us these laws that don't seem to be doing nearly as much benefit as they do harm. So one thing I would suggest to people is that hold your public officials and elected officials accountable, and have high expectations. And if we do that, then we'll tend to get better outcomes.
So with that, we're going to move to the Q&A, but leading with the are they a villain or are they a savior? Since you teed it up that way, Lee, let's start with the state of California. One of the questions that comes to us is, how does California exit the financial situation it's in currently? As you noted, many California employers expect more of their employees who formerly worked from centralized offices will work remotely. This means less demand to live in high tax states. California's plan is to raise tax on the highest income earners and potentially add a wealth tax. Do policymakers need to come up with new tools? And if so, what might they be?
So California remains the 5th largest economy in the world. California workers are among the most productive. Our household incomes are higher than the rest of the state. but those higher household incomes don't come close to addressing the differences in cost of living in California. And as a result, a lot of people are now leaving California, and many businesses are leaving California. So in a highly fluid economy, where states compete against each other, and where California has to compete not only with Texas, where it's losing an awful lot of economic activity too, but many other countries, we have to make sure that the state is competitive, that it has a cost basis that makes sense for businesses to locate in. In terms of business expenses, including business taxes, California is 49th. And California is 41st in school quality. And when we think about people living in California, not only do they have to confront the issue of paying for the mortgage, but then they have to think about, gosh, is my child or my children, are they going to get a quality education in their local school? Do I have to pay for private school? So I think there's, we don't have time to go through, I think, all the reforms, but I do think that the folks in Sacramento need to look in the mirror a bit and ask themselves the question. We are losing the race. We're big, yes. We're highly productive, yes. We've got Silicon Valley, yes. But we need to make some changes, and we need to make sure we're competitive. We need to make sure that cost of living is not over the top. We need to make sure the business regulation in the state is not over the top, which it somewhat is right now. We need to make sure the business costs and taxes are not over the top. So again, public officials need to think about this, and voters need to think about electing the kind of public officials that will make the state lower cost, more business friendly, a place that's somewhat easier to live.
So John, I'm going to come back to you with sort of more of a national question, which is the biggest wholesale shift from where we are today is the blue sweep. Take the Senate, White House, and one of the questions is would you, assuming if you have a blue sweep of the Senate and the White House, and assuming it's a small sweep, a small majority in the Senate, please assess the likelihood that the economy grows below potential, given the risk for additional regulation and what effect that might have on job growth, and given sort of the history of blue deficit spending and tax increases. What does that do, if you end up with a Biden-Harris administration and a Schumer-led Senate?
So I think what's most important, and history shows this, of course, there's always disagreement about it, but what works well is a tax system which doesn't interfere with people's decisions. So tax rates are reasonably low, and marginal tax rates are what's important, I think, in this respect. There's a question about the philosophy of people coming in and if there's a Republican senator or not. But there's a difference there. You can see it on the platforms of the candidates, and there will be higher taxes as described by a Biden-Harris administration. Regulation, that's harder to say. I mean, it's the devil's in the details. If you look at all the things that have happened, those have to do with appointments, like Ajit Pai, the FCC, for example, and that's going to make a difference whether those people are appointed. But I think it makes a real difference on growth. And let's assume we come out of this pandemic and we're back to normal in some sense of the word. Then I don't want to have 1% growth. I don't want to have I want to have 3% growth, because that deals with the poverty problems we have. It deals with all sorts of other things, public service problems, infrastructure problems. And so that means we have to have a different policy than one that's not conducive to growth. And there's just lots of evidence for that. Maybe it's hard for people to see. One thing I like about this discussion tonight is it focuses on the economics. There's so little focus on that in the public debate at this point. Everything except the economics seems to be discussed, but it's so important for our future.
So I'll go to the next question. I'll throw it out to either one of you. Somebody asked, what's your opinion on the relatively new economic theory regarding the deficit myth?
Is there any more detail about that question? Is the idea that the deficit just doesn't matter?
That's all I have. So
okay,
I can move past it. Who do you?
No, I can take a shot at that. So I'm not absolutely sure what the the person is referring to, I think it might be the idea that deficits maybe don't matter as much as we thought they thought they did in the past. I mean, one really fortuitous issue right now is that.
Well, and Lee, I'm going to combine it. I'm just looking at questions coming in.
Okay.
The other question is going to be: is there a point where there is no more debt that we can take on, and sort of,
Yeah.
how bottomless is the well?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There is a point. For a country like the U.S., we don't really know what it is. What we do know, based on the experiences of other countries, is that point can change very, very quickly in terms of how markets view a sovereign government's ability to roll over debt or repay debt. If we go back, 10 years or so to the financial crisis and the well-known case of Greece, the Greek government was borrowing at 3 or 4% per year, and within about 4 months, that 3 or 4% per year had gone up to 10 or 15% per year. So these things can change very, very quickly depending upon how investors perceive the credit worthiness of a government. Now, the United States is very far from Greece, so we're now in a position with remarkably low interest rates. The 30-year Treasury rate earlier today was something like 1.57%, which is below the rate of inflation. I mean, not that this is an investment advisory show, but for those of you with mortgages, I'd suggest take a look around because refis might be very attractive. So that number, 1.57% at 30-year paper, indicates that we're not close to a tipping point, but every country has one, just like every company has one. It's hard to predict what it is, but when people start getting worried, it can snowball very, very quickly. We've seen this just so many times. I mentioned Greece. It happened in Mexico, and of course, John was fundamentally involved with that. It's happened in South America many, many times. We don't want that to happen here. So what that means is that it's better to deal with this sooner than later. I think politicians, both Democrat and Republican, have can be faulted for kicking the can down the road over the last 30 years in terms of things such as Social Security and Medicare. It's just not politically popular to take on those issues. So they don't until voters absolutely demand that. So it may be the time that we start demanding that from our politicians to deal with these issues, so we don't have to worry about that tipping point.
Great. Well, John, the next question was teed up specifically for you. It says, we are arguably experiencing our third economic bubble in 20 years. Many attribute this to the Fed's market interventions. Professor Taylor has suggested a rules-based framework the Fed should use to set interest rates. However, why do we need the Fed to set interest rates, prices, when the market typically does a better job of setting prices than the central planning mechanism? It's been suggested that the Fed's mandate, it's been suggested that the Fed's mandate should be limited to providing liquidity in crisis at a penalty rate. What are your thoughts on such a framework?
No, I'm glad the questioner is thinking deeply about these questions. So there is a view that all the central bank needs to do is keep the growth rate of money constant. Milton Friedman argued that, and then interest rates will go up and down depending. I think what we've seen, though, is it's hard to measure what money is. It changes, the definitions change. So that became less practical, and people moved away from that. And instead, they wanted a rule-like procedure. It's almost like a market, which determines the rate. Try to mimic the market as much as you can, in the sense there's not a lot of intervention. There's a fairly reliable way that the central bank operates. And experience has shown that works pretty well, very well, I would say. And when we get away from that, whether there's interventions and specific efforts to move the rates in different directions than the market suggests, then we get into trouble. So I think the intent of the question makes sense, but to deliver an answer, you have to recognize that some rule-like mechanism for the interest rate is a better way to proceed than just let it go completely.
Okay. So Lee, we'll come back to you. Do the panelists agree with the Robert Putnam assessment? We're again living through some of the worst aspects of the Gilded Age, specifically with regard to social costs of wealth disparity. If not, why not? And if so, what are the economic policies likely to begin moving the U.S. towards a more sustainable economic as was achieved in the generations following the Gilded Age?
Okay, I'm not familiar with that book, but I think I get the gist of the question, which is related to, are we seeing some adverse economic outcomes because wealth has become increasingly concentrated among a smaller group of people? So in terms of policies that I would like to see, we
Well,
want
and Lee, I'm going to combine that with another one, which has
yeah,
come in, which
sure.
is, should the government try to reduce income inequality? So I think the two sort of go together, and what should be the role of the government in that?
Yeah. Um, so in my view, policies that expand opportunities for everyone, that facilitate investment. Investments create new goods, new opportunities, they raise worker productivity. These are all good things. These are the things that we would like to see taking place. Now, in terms of inequality, there's an issue if inequality is the consequence of a political elite that has undue access to politicians and can get preferential rules passed. And I think there's a lot of concern about this in the country. I think the rise of Bernie Sanders in 2016, he came out of, he came out of really nowhere. He captured a lot of people's imaginations with the idea that there's a political elite out there and they play by different rules than the rest of us. And then you flip that over, and I think a lot of the people that voted for Trump in 2016 had similar views that there were political elites that were not playing by the same set of rules. Very different types of concerns, but I think we saw that. So one response to that is to make federal and state legislation just a lot simpler. So I'd love to see a much simpler tax code without all of the subsidies and loopholes that exist right now in the tax code that we have. We could boost growth, I think, enormously with a wholesale change in the tax code. That's difficult to implement politically. That said, ideally, we would like to see government policies be put in place that create opportunities. And if we look at, say, the richest guy in the world is Jeff Bezos. He's worth over $200 billion, largely because of his ownership stake in Amazon. And people, and I got a call from a reporter on that not that long ago saying, well, what would you say to people about how Jeff Bezos has profited from the pandemic? And my response was, well, look at all the good that Amazon has done. Look how many elderly people or people with pre-existing conditions who it was really risky for them to go out and shop. Look how many of them got access to 2-day shipping. Look how Amazon was able to scale up those operations. Look at the people who live in rural areas where there are few stores that they have access to. They can purchase millions of products from Amazon. Look at the risks he took. Look at the amazing idea he had. Yes, he's worth over $200 billion, but then again, there's about 140 million Americans who are prime customers, and they get enormous value from that. So I'd prefer people not to think so much about the high end, but rather about a healthy economy as one that creates opportunities for everyone. And schooling policy can go a long way towards that, and policies that promote and facilitate innovation and investment go a long way towards that.
So I'm going to give you, John, the last question here. I'm going to combine several, but if you can go, you got about 60 seconds to answer, having to do with the costs and risks of monetary policy, the expansion of the balance sheet, and if inflation is really subdued, when can the Fed, can it stay subdued with the Fed buying assets at the comment of global monetary policy? And we got to wind up then.
So to make a short answer as possible, I think it's time for the Fed to be thinking about what's next. So I suppose it did okay in the April-May period, but then what's next is very important. And we can go back to what kind of policy works well. It's where it's clear what's going on. But I just maybe conclude with one point about what we can do. One of my colleagues at Hoover and also of Lee, Tom Sowell, just wrote a book called Charter Schools and Their Enemies. It's about New York, and it's about all the things that are beneficial if we just allow a little more freedom in the school system. And I think we don't want to forget that. It's part of equal opportunity. It's part of helping people who need it. It's really a very important thing. So if we could just bring more attention to that, it would be great.
Well, gentlemen, thank you both very, very much. Hopefully, those of you listening to this have enjoyed it. And with that, I am going to turn it back to Dora.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Lee. Thank you, John. I am very sorry we were not able to get to many of the questions that were submitted. It was sort of an overwhelming number. Next time, please try and get your questions in ahead of time, and we'll definitely try and get to them. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. This is an event, this type of an event is one we'd like to repeat in the future. If you're interested in being involved in more econ events, if you're interested in what Lee had to say about a potential center, please get in touch with us. Thank you so much, and go Bruins.
Thank you.